Venus Wars, perhaps my favorite film. I'm not going to try and tell you that this is an amazing film and you're wrong for not loving it. Not everyone will enjoy this film, because it has flaws, and honestly that's what I love about it. It has some scenes in it that quite literally defy logic as to why they're there, and the characters are kind of clunky. But the film, overall, provides an atmosphere and feeling that I don't think can be duplicated by many other stories. In this review, I'm going to discuss the plot of the film and its merits, as well as kind of go off the deep end and discuss the different military doctrines behind the Ishtar army and the Aphrodia army. But this review will be based pretty much entirely off the film. I unfortunately have not read the mangas. Which that might happen later at some point, but we never know. But moving on. Something that draws me in about Venus Wars is that I wouldn't say it has a conventional narrative structure. Essentially, everything you're exposed to in this story is first introduced to you through the eyes of someone just arriving on Venus from Earth. And the manner in which they pull this off is actually kind of subtle and clever. The film opens with a brief explanation as to how people come to live on Venus. Basically, a huge comet strikes the surface, blowing off a ton of its acid atmosphere, and giving it some liquid water on the surface. It also had to have changed Venus's rotational speed. A typical Venusian day is about 116 Earth days. Anyway, the film doesn't want to spend too much time on this. It really just kind of wants to get you introduced to the story and how people begin to live there. So essentially, after the comet strikes, the humans began building large terraforming facilities that start turning the liquid ocean into oxygen on the surface. So after several decades, humans have created sustainable colonies on Venus. And like all human endeavors, the people eventually separate into rival factions. Ishtar and Aphrodia become the primary political rivals on Venus, and our story begins at the height of the tensions between these two powers. The story's first reveal is that of Susan Summers, an independent press reporter who just arrived on Venus for the first time. She, however, has been stopped by Aphrodian police, and is being strip-searched. This illustrates a few things to me as a viewer. It first shows the corrupt nature of the Io Aphrodian police department that potentially stems even further up the government. And it also demonstrates to me that our perspective initially is that of Susan Summers. And like her, we're being exposed to Venus for the first time. So in that regard, we're being shown a new culture from her perspective. So things might be a bit different. What the opening scene illustrates to me is even though human beings have settled other worlds, we're still far from utopian in our practices and thinking. And the corrupt nature of the Aphrodisian government already shown demonstrates that there are still a lot of problems on Venus. When a lot of people critique Venus Wars, they point to Susan Summers as being an annoying, unlikable character. However, she isn't meant to be liked. She's a selfish person that basically went to Venus as a gamble to get a big story. She, despite her bubbly attempts at being a nice person, is really just in it for herself. However, she does later fall in love with a Venusian boy, but we'll get into that. The world this film creates is gritty and dark, and that's what Venus Wars does really well. Its atmosphere. The painstaking detail in every cell is beyond gorgeous. And the first battle sequence alone exposes how much painstaking effort they put into every minute of animation in this film. Before the main action in the film begins, Susan Summers is looking for an informant in a bar. And while she's there, she notices some type of sporting event on the televisions there. It's almost like Rollerball in its brutality and simplistic rules. However, it's done on a gyro bike, a one-wheeled motorcycle. And as soon as she sees the sport, we're actually introduced to who I would consider the main characters of the story. So this, in a way, is how the story is being introduced to us, again, through her perspective. And I think it's kind of a clever and subtle way to introduce us to things in this world. Basically, our main characters are shown as competitors in this sporting event. Aphrodia seems to have an interest in high-speed, single-wheeled bikes, and this will play a greater role later in the film. But anyway, back to the major battle. Air raid sirens begin to blare, and the army of Ishtar comes over the horizon, and just smashes the Aphrodian forces. Basically, Ishtar blitzes straight for the capital city of Aphrodia, Io. The manner in which Ishtar drops their army onto the Aphrodians is jaw-dropping, and its intensity and the manner in which they pull off the operation is awe-inspiring. Aphrodian forces are just completely outclassed by the tanks the Ishtarians are using. The large size and heavy armor of these tanks make them almost unstoppable, and the under-equipped forces of the Aphrodians just seem to crumble in the wake of these tanks. The Ishtarian tanks resemble the designs of Russian tank killers from late World War II, with a low profile and no main turret, making the design that much stronger with no turret ring to weaken the overall structural integrity. Aphrodite forces seem to be armed primarily with light tanks that are not capable of handling the heavy assault tanks of the Ishtarians. This shows something about the nature of the wars on Venus. It is somewhat shown that Venus doesn't have many oceans, so operations would have to be undertaken over land or by air. So wars would have to be extremely long affairs, with incredibly long supply lines, without large waterways to transport heavy goods. All of these things would have to be transported via convoy or train. So wars on Venus would be very long-distance affairs, where an army's ability to maneuver would be beneficial. So the Aphrodite army seems to reflect this kind of concept, with clearly lighter armor and speed in mind. So in this moment, you can see a difference in doctrine between Ishtar and Aphrodia. It's clear the Ishtarians have built their army to be a hard-smashing broadsword, capable of breaking through the enemy's front line. And it would appear the Aphrodians were completely caught off guard by the blitz and deep penetrating motion the Ishtarians made with them with their airships, which would be a difficult maneuver for anyone to defend against. And the two ideologies of these armies will come into play later in the film as well. But basically, the whole battle is a breathtaking affair that the shock and awe of its overall intensity leads to the Aphrodian government surrendering and leaving the capital of Io under an Ishtarian garrison. During the battle, Student Summer actually links up with the Killer Commandos, who are our main characters from that racing event. With the war effectively over after the surrender of the Io government, many in Io try to return to their normal lives. However, the presence of Ishtarian forces is a constant strain on their daily lives. In scenes that resemble something out of Italian films made just after World War II, the many sites people travel to have been destroyed and wrecked from the major battle that took Io. However, there are constant uprisings in Io, and this causes the Aphrodite police to become ever more oppressive in their handling of civilians, in order to not have a crackdown on them by the Ishtarian occupational forces. It would appear many in the Io police force are actually collaborating with the Ishtarian forces. This makes them more aggressive, and they begin cracking down on independent news outlets as well as the amount of time they spend cracking down on civilians. And this also leads to our main character Hero having a run-in with them where he has to flee after an altercation occurs. The chase sequence that follows is actually well done and has a good intensity to it. And at the end, Hero is actually struck in the leg by an Aphrodite bullet, so his own countrymen have effectively shot him. Something Venus Wars does very well is the action sequences. However, the moments when it goes into these almost quasi-relationship love stories, it gets very clunky and very awkward. So Hero basically has a thing for Maggie, a girl that hangs out with his group, and they end up having this kind of weird scene after she patches him up. And so they do have feelings for each other, but it's just kind of an awkward scene that doesn't hold together very well. But thankfully the scene's interrupted by her father coming home from work, and he informs her that they'll be leaving the city. After this, Hero sneaks back to the garage he's been staying at, where he essentially discusses with his gang that they've decided to try attacking an Ishtarian tank position. After discussing it for some time, they decide to take out the tank using the weapons Gary has in his garage. They execute the plan. However, the light weapons they have are not enough to penetrate the heavy armor of the Ishtar tank. But the key part of the plan was to bait the tank away from its position, and then use a large fuel tanker to take it out like napalm. The plan worked well, but however, the Ishtar tank had a really impressive fire suppression system which prevented basically the fuel from igniting it and killing the crew inside. When Hero realizes the tank isn't dead, his friends start getting picked off one by one, and so Hero takes it upon himself to take out the tank using a creative method. You know, I'm not going to spoil it for you. If you want to see that part, I'll make you watch the movie. But however, after he takes out the tank, Ishtar reinforcements show up. And the group is actually saved by a group of resistance riders who actually take them to their camp. It turns out, a large part of the Aphrodite army actually went into exile and is hiding in the desert. And based on the equipment they're using, the Aphrodite army had actually planned for Io to fall. And it would appear, despite the failure of the government, the military had plans in action to counter the Ishtarian invasion. It's revealed to us that the Aphrodite army in exile has developed a new weapon system. The system's designed to be fast and agile, but most importantly, it has a new cannon that can penetrate the heavy armor of the Ishtarian tanks. The base the Aphroditeans use is actually a mobile carrier. It can carry and deploy dozens of this new weapon system. This falls into the long-range engagement doctrine that I had talked about before. The Aphrodisians have the ability to engage the Ishtarians whenever they choose, at their leisure, without allowing the Ishtarians to utilize their strength against them. And this allows the Aphrodisians to dictate any terms of engagement. This is what I love about Venus Wars. The level of thought put into how the militaries would function is really well fleshed out. Basically, Ishtar has geared itself and its army to fight the enemy head-on and punch through them. However, the Aphrodisians, in contrast, have developed their army now not to fight the Ishtarians head-on, but to fight them in an asymmetrical warfare that allow them to essentially control the terms of engagement and slowly pick off the Ishtarians one at a time, without risking too much of their own men and material. The Aphrodisian army adopts a doctrine of attacking the Ishtarians where they're weakest, asymmetrical warfare. The Aphrodisians essentially have developed a manufacturing base that allows them to replace this new monobike weapon system incredibly fast. It's cheap and does a lot of damage, and most importantly, can be replaced quickly. And also, there's never a shortage of riders willing to try it. So the Commandos, the gang we've been following through basically most of the film, are essentially forcibly conscripted into this resistance. However, some of them don't want to be there and they want to leave. And Hero essentially tries to put himself out there and get them out, but ends up having to stay in their place. Susan Summers is picked up as well, and she essentially at this point in the story has developed feelings for a young Venusian boy named Will, and he unfortunately dies in an engagement with Ishtar using the new weapon system, and she manages to escape to go looking for him and flees the resistance. However, Hero is forced to stay and fight alongside them. By this point in the story, the Aphrodisian forces have managed to pick away at the Ishtarian supply lines, leaving the forces in Io cut off from the rest of Ishtarian support, in similar fashion to how Stalingrad was cut off, with German forces being trapped inside. The only route for escape for the Ishtarian forces will be the spaceport.
I don't want to hear your excuses. I want results. This is General Donner. Why aren't the fuel tankers here? I know you're under fire. If the road's been blocked, then find a way round. Find a way. We must get ammunition by nightfall. Sir?
What I find intriguing about Venus Wars is that many of the events are centered around or are stemmed off as soon as Susan Summers is exposed to them. So the Aphrodisian forces beginning their action to retake Io is actually introduced by Susan Summers. After losing Will, she decides to assassinate the Ishtarian general. However, she fails because she doesn't understand how a safety catch works on a pistol. And after the attempt, the general decides to take the field on his own, and personally lead the defense of Io and the spaceport, which is actually the target Hero is assigned to take. So the battle this time is actually a fight between two personal people that we're introduced to in the story, as opposed to two faceless armies. Because it's almost like his ego can't deal with the idea of losing. On many levels, this last battle resembles the situation that the Germans faced in Stalingrad, with the Soviet forces completely surrounding the city. The German general was actually promoted so that he would make a last stand and fight to the last man. However, in real life, unlike what General Gerhard Donner is doing in Venus Wars, the German general surrendered, as opposed to letting his men die a basic slaughter. Hero manages to defeat the Ishtarian general, and after running out of ammo, Hero baits the Ishtarian general into shooting out the large launch tower, causing it to collapse and crush the Ishtarian general's tank. So after that, the Ishtarian forces surrender, and Io is liberated. Hero is allowed to leave the army and search for Maggie. Before he leaves Io on his search, he runs into Susan Summers being forced onto a bus. She yells to him the location of Maggie and that she's at a refugee camp. This is where I want to say that I think Venus Wars is actually the perspective of Susan Summers. After she's forced onto the bus and forced to return to Earth, Hero goes on a long journey to find Maggie, and the whole scene is kind of done in a very romantic, him going through the wastelands to find her. And it ends in this kind of romantic scene where he pulls into the camp and he finds her. However, the next scene is Susan Summers hitting print on her keyboard. I would like to present that the whole story of Venus Wars was just her recounting of the events and time she spent on Venus. So the whole film is that, the news story she just printed. The action is well done because she was there writing it, and it was what she saw. The scenes with people were bad because she's bad at writing people. She's kind of like the Michael Bay of newspapers. So, in essence, the human elements are bad because she wasn't very good at writing them. And the action was awesome because she's just good at writing action. And to me, that's kind of what I like to pretend is why some of those sequences are so awkward and strange. And that's Venus Wars. I've always had a deep love of this film because of the atmosphere and the attention to detail it pays to basically machines and things like that. Its flaws fall into the human category because it just doesn't know where to go with that. But for me, that's forgivable, because the film does such a good job in creating an atmosphere and a universe that is almost livable and has flaws and feels real to me in some respect as to how well the story's thought out. But thanks for watching. I hope you take the time to pick up or watch this film if you have the opportunity. But have a good night, day, or evening, whatever it is you're doing. If you like this content, I highly suggest you check out my website, Historicnerd.com. I also highly suggest you check out theconsoleexplosion.com. It has a number of other content providers there that generate quite a bit of good work that you might find enjoyable. If you want to say something to me directly, feel free to contact me at historicalnerd on twitter.com. So feel free. Alright, thank you very much for dropping by. Have a great night, evening, or day, whatever it is you're doing. Bye.